Step out of the gray and into a vivid reality where every emotion is heightened and every color tells its own story. Our cinematic visuals bring a new level of intensity to the narratives you love and the characters you follow. Click subscribe now for a more vivid experience today.
Before I write, let me check the front-end design skill to make sure I produce the best possible output format. I returned home 3 days early from a work trip, and I did not call ahead. I never do, not anymore. My wife, Margaret, had told me years ago that she liked the surprise. Said it reminded her of the early days when I used to show up at her door with coffee and no warning. So I kept the habit. I thought it made her smile. What I found that Tuesday afternoon did not make either of us smile. I pulled into the driveway of the house I had spent 26 years building into a home. Not just buying, but genuinely building, with my own hands on most of it. And I noticed a car parked along the curb that I did not recognize. A silver Lexus, newer model, Ontario plates. I sat in my truck for a moment just looking at it. Something in my chest felt off, the way it does when you walk into a room and the air is wrong before you can name why. I went in through the side door, the one off the garage. I always do, old habit from 30 years working in construction. You don't track the front entry if you can help it. I heard voices before I saw anyone. They were coming from the living room. One voice I knew immediately. It was the voice of my son-in-law's mother, Diane Kershaw, high and precise, the kind of voice that fills a room without asking permission. I had never liked that voice, though I had spent 4 years pretending otherwise for my daughter Sophie's sake. I set my bag down quietly by the garage door and walked toward the sound. Margaret was sitting in the armchair by the window, the one she always curls up in when she reads. But she was not reading. She was sitting rigid, both hands folded in her lap. And even from across the room I could see that her eyes were red. She had been crying, not just recently, for a while, by the look of it. Across from her on the sofa sat Diane Kershaw and her husband Frank. Between them on the coffee table was a spread of papers. Several pages, printed, with colored tabs marking specific lines. The kind of document you bring somewhere when you want someone to sign something, and you don't want them to have time to think about what it says. Neither of them had noticed me yet. Diane was speaking in that measured, reasonable tone people use when they are trying to sound like they are doing you a favor. Margaret, we've been over this. It's just a formality. The bank requires it to process the loan. You're not losing anything. You're helping Sophie and David start their life properly. Surely you can see that. My wife said nothing. She was staring at the papers. I stepped into the room. Diane looked up first. For just a moment, something crossed her face. Not quite guilt, but something close to calculation. Then she smiled. Robert, we didn't know you were back. Clearly, I said. I looked at my wife. Are you all right? Margaret looked at me, and I watched something in her face shift, relief, I think, and also something that looked like shame, which broke my heart a little, because she had absolutely nothing to be ashamed of. I'm fine, she said, which was not true. I looked at the papers on the table. I did not touch them. What is this? Frank spoke up then, the way he sometimes did when Diane needed a moment to recalibrate. He was a big man, retired from something in finance, and he had a way of speaking that suggested he found most conversations beneath him. It's a loan co-signature arrangement. David and Sophie are looking to expand the business. Their bank requires a secondary property guarantee. We thought, given that you and Margaret are family, it would be a straightforward conversation. A secondary property guarantee, I repeated. For the house, yes. It would be held as collateral against the loan, standard practice. I looked at my wife again. How long have they been here? Almost 2 hours, she said quietly. 2 hours. I thought about that. 2 hours of Diane Kershaw's reasonable voice, and those papers sitting on the coffee table with their little colored tabs, and my wife sitting in her reading chair with her hands folded and her eyes going red. I'd like you to leave now, I said. Diane's smile did not waver. Robert, I understand this is a surprise, but if you'd just give us a few minutes to explain the full picture. I understand the full picture, I said. You came to my house while I was away and spent 2 hours pressuring my wife to sign documents she doesn't want to sign. I'd like you to leave." Frank stood up. He was trying to make his height feel like something. "There's no need for this kind of tone. We're family." "You're my daughters-in-laws," I said. "That's not the same thing. Please gather your papers and go." There was a moment, a long one, where Diane looked at me the way she sometimes looked at David when he had disappointed her, like she was deciding whether I was worth more effort. Then she began collecting the papers from the table. She did it slowly, carefully, without any sign of hurry, because people like Diane Kershaw do not leave rooms quickly. When they were gone, I sat down on the couch and looked at my wife. "Tell me everything," I said. She told me. It had started, she said, about 3 weeks earlier, though I had not known it at the time. David, my son-in-law Sophie's husband of 4 years, had called her on a Thursday morning when he knew I would be at the job site. He had told her that he and Sophie were in trouble, that the renovation business he had started 2 years ago had taken on too much too fast, and that they had a gap in their financing that needed to be filled urgently, or they would lose a contract that represented most of their income for the year. He had asked if Margaret and I would consider putting the house up as collateral, just temporarily, just to bridge the gap. Margaret had told him she would have to talk to me about it, which was the right answer. But then Diane had called the next day, and then Frank, and then Sophie herself crying, asking her mother not to make this harder than it needed to be. And then the calls had become more frequent, and the tone of them had shifted. And by the time Diane and Frank had shown up at the door that Tuesday with their printed papers and their colored tabs, Margaret had been worn down enough that she had let them in, which she told me she regretted the moment she did it. She had not signed anything. I want to be clear about that. My wife had sat in that room for 2 hours, and she had not signed a single page. But I could see what 2 hours had cost her. I held her hand while she talked, and I did not say much. And when she was finished, I told her that she had done nothing wrong, that she had been strong, that I was home now. What I did not tell her yet was what I was already beginning to plan. I spent that evening making calls. I have a friend, Gordon, who retired from real estate law 3 years ago and still consults part-time. We had been in the same hockey league for 15 years. He is the kind of man who tells you the truth without softening it, which is the only kind of lawyer worth knowing. I called him that night and described the document as Margaret had described it to me, a co-signature loan arrangement using the house as collateral. Gordon was quiet for a moment. Then he asked me a few questions. Whether we had been provided a copy, whether any independent legal counsel had been mentioned, whether the loan amount had been specified in the paperwork. The answer to all three was no. Gordon told me that what I was describing was not a standard practice, that any legitimate lender requiring a co-signature arrangement involving a third-party property would require independent legal representation for the co-signers, that the absence of that requirement combined with the pressure timeline suggested the document was not what it had been presented as. He asked if I could get him a copy of the papers. I told him I would work on it. The next morning I called Sophie. I had not slept particularly well, but I was calm. I want you to understand that. I was not angry in the way that burns hot and makes you say things you regret. I was angry in the way that settles cold into your chest and makes you think very clearly. Sophie answered on the second ring. She sounded cautious, which told me she had already spoken to her in-laws. "Dad," she said, "I'd like you to come over this afternoon," I told her. "Just you." Not David, not his parents, you. She came at 2:00. She looked tired, my Sophie. The same tired her mother had looked the night before. The kind that comes from weeks of being pulled in directions that don't make sense. She sat at the kitchen table, and I made tea, because that is what you do. I asked her to tell me about the business. What came out over the next hour was not exactly what David and his parents had described. The renovation company was not on the verge of losing a major contract. It had already lost it, 3 months ago, because David had missed a series of deadlines. The loan was not to bridge a financing gap. It was to cover a debt that David had accumulated partly through the business and partly through what Sophie described, quietly and without looking at me, as a period of very poor decisions that she was still trying to fully understand herself. I asked her about the document. Sophie said she had not seen the full document, that David had told her it was a standard co-signature arrangement. that his parents had offered to handle the paperwork because they had experience with this kind of thing. I asked her when she had last spoken to a lawyer about any of this. She had not. I told her about my conversation with Gordon. I told her as gently as I could what Gordon had suggested the document might actually be. I watched my daughter's face while I talked. I watched the moment it shifted. She started crying, not the soft kind, the sudden kind that comes when something you have been not quite knowing becomes something you can no longer not know. I let her cry. I gave her tissues, and I refilled her tea, and I did not say anything until she was ready. When she was, I told her that I was not angry at her, that I believed she had been kept in the dark about a great deal of this. But I told her clearly that I needed her to help me understand the full situation, and that I needed her to do it honestly, because what happened next would depend on what was actually true. She told me everything she knew. It took most of the afternoon. David's debt was significant, somewhere in the range of $90,000, spread across business accounts and 2 personal lines of credit. Frank Kershaw had been covering portions of it quietly for over a year, and the condition of that coverage, as best Sophie understood it, was that David and his parents would find a way to consolidate everything into a single secured loan, a loan that, according to Gordon's reading of the document, would have used our home as the primary security, not as a co-signature guarantee, but as the actual collateral asset. If David defaulted, which, given the trajectory Gordon and I were now looking at, was not an unlikely outcome, the lender would have had a claim on our house. Margaret and I had lived in that house for 26 years. I had poured new concrete on the back patio with my own hands. I had rebuilt the deck twice, the second time better than the first. My wife had her garden along the south fence, the one she had been adding to every spring since our younger daughter was in primary school. That house was not an asset on a balance sheet. It was our life. I thanked Sophie for being honest with me. I told her that I loved her, and that this was not over yet, but that she should let me work on it. I asked her not to tell David or his parents what we had discussed. She nodded. She looked smaller than usual, sitting at my kitchen table, but she also looked like something had been put down that she had been carrying for a while. Over the following week, I worked quietly. Gordon connected me with a colleague of his, a woman named Patricia, who specialized in financial fraud and had handled several cases involving real estate document misrepresentation. I brought her the details of the document as Sophie had been able to partially describe it, and what Margaret remembered of the specific language. Patricia told me that what I was describing had characteristics consistent with a pattern she had seen before, not an outright forgery, but a document designed to obscure the actual nature of the agreement through legal language that most people without a background in property law would not parse correctly. She told me that if the document existed in the form described, it was worth filing a formal complaint with the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada, and potentially with local police, depending on what a full review revealed. She also told me something else. She told me that Frank Kershaw's name appeared in a civil complaint filed 2 years earlier in a different province, an allegation involving a similar arrangement with another family. The case had been settled quietly. No admission of liability. When she told me that, I sat with it for a long time. I thought about my wife in that armchair, her hands folded, her eyes red. I thought about 2 hours of Diane Kershaw's reasonable voice. I thought about the family across from her who had come into our home, with papers and tabs and a story about helping Sophie, and who had done the same thing to someone else, somewhere else, before us. I thought about what Gordon had said to me that first night, without being asked. Robert, you need to protect yourself, not just from the document, from the people. He was right. I called Sophie. I told her that I needed to see both her and David, and that I would prefer it if his parents were not present, but that I understood as she felt she needed to tell him in advance. I told her what I was going to do because she deserved to know, and because she was my daughter. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said, "I'm sorry, Dad." I told her the same thing I had told her the week before, that I was not angry at her, that I believed she had been used in this as much as the rest of us. David and Sophie came to the house on a Saturday. Margaret sat with me at the kitchen table. Sophie sat beside her husband, but angled slightly away from him in the way people do when they have had several days of difficult conversations. David looked like he had not been sleeping. I had Patricia's preliminary findings in a folder. I put it on the table. I did not open it immediately. I looked at David and I told him, without raising my voice, what I knew. I told him about the document's actual legal structure. I told him about the civil complaint in the other province. I told him that Patricia had already begun the process of filing with the Financial Consumer Agency, and that depending on how the next few weeks proceeded, there was a reasonable possibility that this would become a matter for the police. David looked at the folder. He did not look at me. He said very quietly that he had not known the document was structured that way, that his parents had told him it was standard. I told him I did not entirely disbelieve him, but that it did not change the facts of what had been brought into my home. I told him that what happened next depended largely on what he chose to do in the following days, that if he was willing to cooperate with Patricia and provide a full accounting of the debt and the document's origins, that cooperation would matter, that if he was not, then we would proceed without it, and the outcome would be less predictable. He asked what cooperation would look like. I told him a written statement to Patricia detailing the full history of the arrangement, including the conversations with his parents about the document, full disclosure of the debt and its current status, and a direct conversation with my wife, not with me, with my wife, in which he acknowledged what had been done to her in that living room. He agreed. All of it. The conversation with Frank and Diane Kershaw happened the following week, and I was not present for it. Patricia was. It was not a social call. Frank's response was to threaten a counter-complaint, which Patricia described to me afterward as not unexpected and not particularly concerning given what she already had. Diane said very little. By the end of that month, the formal complaint had been filed. The investigation that followed was not fast, these things never are, but it moved. 4 months later, we received notification that the Financial Consumer Agency had found sufficient grounds for a formal proceeding. 6 months after that, Frank Kershaw faced a civil judgment for the arrangement, not the first, as we knew, but this time without a quiet settlement. The judgment required the full dissolution of the debt structure he had built around it, including the formal acknowledgement that the document presented to my wife had misrepresented the nature of the agreement. He did not go to prison. I will be honest about that. I had hoped for more, and so had Patricia, and so had Gordon when I told him. The law moves in its own way, and what it found was sufficient for a civil remedy, but not a criminal one. That is a frustration I have made my peace with, because I have had to. But Frank Kershaw's financial reputation in this province did not survive intact, and the network of contacts he had used for these arrangements was significantly disrupted. Patricia told me that 2 other families had come forward after our complaint became part of the public record. I think about those families sometimes. I think about the fact that they came forward because we did. David and Sophie are separated now. It did not happen because of what I did. It had been coming for a long time, and Sophie has told me more than once that the clarity she got during those weeks was something she needed even though it was painful. They are working through it as adults. I'm proud of her. My wife still has her garden along the south fence. Last spring, she added a section of lavender along the back corner, which she had been planning for years and kept putting off. I built her a new raised bed for it out of cedar. It took a weekend. We still live in the house I spent 26 years building into a home. Some evenings we sit on the back deck and I have a coffee and she has her tea. And we don't talk about any of this because there are nights when you are simply glad to be exactly where you are, and that is enough. I am 63 years old. I built my career with my hands, and I built my home the same way. And I will tell you something I have learned in all those years. The people who want what you have built will always tell you they are trying to help you. They will use the word family. They will use the word standard. They will bring papers with colored tabs and a reasonable voice. Learn the difference between someone who is helping you and someone who is making themselves comfortable in your life while they look for the right moment. It is not always obvious, and by the time it is, they have usually had 2 hours alone with the person you love most. Come home early. That is my advice. Come home early, ask questions, and do not let anyone make you feel like protecting what is yours is the unreasonable thing to do. I came home early on a Tuesday. I am glad I did. I have thought about that Tuesday afternoon many times since it happened. Not with bitterness. I am past that. But with the particular clarity that comes when you finally understand what was actually happening while you thought you were watching something else. What was actually happening was simple, even if it took me weeks to see it fully. Frank and Diane Kershaw had built a system. Not a dramatic one, not a villainous one in the way stories sometimes make these things sound. Just a quiet, patient system of finding people who loved someone and using that love as a lever. They had done it before. They would have done it again. The only question was whether the people they chose would be too tired, too polite, or too afraid to stop them. Margaret was none of those things, as it turned out. She had sat in that armchair for 2 hours, and she had not signed a single page. I have never told her how much that meant to me, not in those exact words, though I think she knows. There is a kind of strength that does not announce itself. It just holds. What I want to say, and I mean this as plainly as I can, is that the outcome of this story was not luck. It was not fate. It was the result of a series of choices, made one at a time by people who decided that the truth was worth the discomfort of pursuing it. I called Gordon because I chose to ask for help rather than try to handle it alone. Sophie told me everything because she chose honesty over loyalty to a version of her life that was no longer real. Patricia filed the complaint because that is what you do when the evidence is there, and the alternative is letting it happen to someone else. Every one of those choices had a cost. Gordon spent hours on something he did not have to care about. Sophie walked through months of painful clarity about her marriage. Patricia worked a case that paid less than her usual work. None of it was easy. All of it mattered. I think we are often taught, quietly, without anyone saying it directly, that protecting yourself is a selfish act, that insisting on what is right makes you difficult, that the gracious thing, the mature thing, the family thing, is to find a way to accommodate whatever is being asked of you, even when what is being asked is wrong. I do not believe that anymore, if I ever did. Wisdom is not the same as compliance. Ethics is not the same as keeping the peace. And the strongest thing I did in this entire situation was not filing the complaint or hiring Patricia or confronting David in my kitchen. The strongest thing I did was come home early on a Tuesday, walk into my own living room and say, "I would like you to leave now." That sentence cost me nothing. It required no lawyer, no paperwork, no strategy. It only required that I believed, without hesitation, that my home was my home and my wife's distress was reason enough. If you take one thing from this story, let it be that you do not need a perfect plan before you are allowed to stand up. You just need to be willing to stand.